let's talk a little bit about one of the things that I did was track down the Brian Aldiss book that you mentioned, and I found the quote from Brian Aldiss very interesting in a couple ways. Science fiction is a big, muscular, horny creature with a massive bristling antenna and proprioceptors on its skull. It has a small sister, a gentle creature with red lips and a dash of stardust in her hair. Her name is Space Opera. This volume is dedicated to her. And then later on, there is, he talks about, I resist the impulse here to define space opera. I had enough trouble defining the term science fiction when writing my history of SF Billionaire Spree. The term is both vague and uninspired. It must have been coined with both affection and some scorn, analogously with soap opera and horse opera. And analogously with opera itself, space opera has certain conventions which are essential to it, which are, in a way, its raison d'etre. One may either like or dislike these conventions, but they cannot be altered except at expense to the whole. And I just want to kind of watch your face as I outline these.
Well, and I'll tell you, this was my first exposure to the term space opera. So okay. This introduction, which I read many times, I can't find my copy. It's here in my direly messy office somewhere. But this was very foundational to my notion of space opera. Just, okay. So.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay, so ideally, the Earth must be in peril. There must be a quest and a man to match the mighty hour. That man must confront aliens and exotic creatures. Space must flow past the ports like wine from a pitcher. And I do love that. Blood must run down the palace steps. And I like that because of the implications of revolution. And ships launch out into the lowering dark. There must be, here's the line when I hit this, and I was kind of like, oh, wow, at the end. There must be a woman fairer than the skies and a villain darker than a black hole. I was like, oh my God, Brian Aldiss, that's interesting. And all must come right in the end. So, I mean, one of the things that I did want to we'll leave the discussion of just how bizarrely racist and sexist that line is, and let other people discuss it, maybe devote like hours to it somewhere else. But he does two things. Like he says, it all must come right in the end. And I'm curious whether you agree about that. And he says an essential element of space opera is escapism.
I would mostly tend to agree, right? Like I said, and to some extent, like I said, his definition here, his description was my first ever description of space opera. And so in a lot of ways, it does match my ideal of space opera without the man to match the hour and the fair woman as a prize, and the question of whether the villain needs to be black, which I'm sure it's the sort of black-hearted thing, but the idea of black being evil is itself. So most of that, yeah, I do think mostly it should all come right in the end, right? And let's be honest, the stuff where it all comes right in the end is a form of escapism, right? Because actually none of us are getting out of this alive. It's not going to come out well in the end for any of us, ultimately. So we pick an ending where it does come out all right. They ride off into the star set, whatever. But at the same time, I hate saying has to. I hate saying ought. If you're going to write a space opera where everything topples and it doesn't come right, it could still be a space opera. But I think ideally, yes, ideally it all comes right in the end. Ideally, your hero manages to do something, and the more peril, the better, right? And space definitely should flow past the portholes like wine. Absolutely.